The box felt heavier than it should have. It contained a decade of my life at Sterling Solutions. A cheap plastic plant, a framed photo of me and Clara in happier times, a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Coder," and a few technical manuals I could have downloaded for free. I stood on the curb, the glass doors of the office building reflecting a gray, indifferent sky. My boss, a man named Patterson, had delivered the news with the practiced sympathy of a mortician. Market realignment, he'd called it. Synergistic downsizing, it all meant the same thing. I was out. My job was gone. For 10 years, I had been the reliable, quiet engine in the background. Now, I was just another casualty of a quarterly report. The first person I thought of was Clara. My wife. How would I tell her? I drove home on autopilot, my mind a churning sea of anxieties. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. My salary had paid the mortgage on our nice suburban house, funded our vacations, and covered the lease on her upscale sedan. It had built the life she'd always said she wanted, or at least the life she tolerated. Lately, there had been a growing distance between us, a coolness in her touch that I had tried to ignore. I told myself it was stress, the monotony of marriage, the simple friction of two lives lived in close proximity for so long. I had been wrong. When I walked through the door, she was on the phone in the kitchen, her back to me. She was laughing, a light, carefree sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. She was talking to David. I knew his voice, his easy cadence. David had been my best friend since college. He was the best man at our wedding. He was a frequent guest at our dinner table, a constant presence in our lives. I set the box down on the floor of the entryway with a soft thud. Clara turned, her smile vanishing the moment she saw my face and the pathetic little box of my professional life. "Thomas? What are you doing home so early? What's that?" I couldn't soften the blow. My mind wasn't capable of finding the right words, so I just used the simple ones. "I was laid off, Clara." The whole department was eliminated. She stared at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. It wasn't shock. It wasn't sympathy. It was something else, something cold and calculating. The mask of the supportive wife dropped, and for the first time, I saw the woman who had been hiding behind it. Her eyes flickered from my face, to the box, and then around the living room, as if she were taking inventory of everything that was about to be lost. "You were what?" she asked, her voice flat. "Laid off. The company is restructuring." She hung up the phone without saying goodbye to David. She walked over to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "So, that's it? After 10 years, they just kick you to the curb? What are we supposed to do now, Thomas? What about the mortgage? My car? What about our lives?" It was all we and our, but the emphasis was squarely on her. There was no, "Are you okay?" No, "We'll get through this together." There was only a cold, panicked anger. The foundation of our life, my steady income, had cracked, and she was terrified the whole structure was about to come down on her head. The next few days were a blur of feigned support and thinly veiled contempt. She made a show of looking at job listings with me, pointing out positions that were clearly beneath my skill level. "Beggars can't be choosers, Thomas," she'd say with a saccharine smile. David came over a few times, clapping me on the shoulder and offering empty platitudes. "You'll land on your feet, buddy. A guy like you? You're a rock." His eyes, however, kept finding Clara's across the room, and they shared glances that made my stomach clench. The inciting incident, the moment the world truly broke, came a week later. I had gone out for a walk, trying to clear my head. When I came back, I heard their voices from the back patio. I stopped by the kitchen window, hidden by the shade of the large oak tree I had planted when we first moved in. "I just can't do it anymore, David," Clara was saying, her voice thick with a frustration that sounded far more genuine than any sympathy she had shown me. "He just sits there, looking pathetic. This isn't the man I married. He's weak." "I know, baby, I know." David's voice was a low murmur. "But you have to be smart about this. You can't just walk out." "Not yet. Smart? I've been smart for 10 years. Stuck in this beige prison with Mr. Reliable. I want a life, David. I want the life you can give me. I'm tired of settling. And you'll have it. Promise. We just need to handle this the right way. Let him find some dead-end job, establish his new, lower income. Then you file. You'll get the house, support. You'll be set. We'll be set. I stood there, frozen, the blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. A cold, methodical strategy to dismantle my life and pick over the carcass. My job loss wasn't a tragedy for her. It was an opportunity. I was no longer an asset. I was a liability to be managed and discarded. The hurt was a physical thing, a white-hot poker in my chest. But beneath it, something else was kindling. A cold, quiet rage. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. I backed away from the window, my movements silent and deliberate. I went upstairs to our bedroom, the room we had shared for a decade, and I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me was a stranger. He looked tired, defeated, and naive. That man died in that moment. I walked back downstairs, my face a calm, unreadable mask. I stepped out onto the patio. They sprang apart, their faces a mixture of guilt and alarm. "Thomas," Clara said, her voice artificially bright. "We were just talking about you." David was saying he might have a lead on a job. David nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "Yeah, buddy. A buddy of mine. His company is looking for IT guys." I looked from his shifty gaze to Clara's brittle smile. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I just nodded. "That's good of you, David. Thanks." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, thick and heavy with everything unsaid. Then I looked at Clara. "We need to talk later that evening." The discussion was short and brutal. She laid out her terms, almost quoting the script I'd heard her rehearse with David. "I think we need some space, Thomas. This whole situation, it's put a lot of strain on us. I think you should go stay with your brother for a while, just until you get back on your feet." "You're kicking me out?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's not like that," she said, though it was exactly like that. "It's for the best. For both of us. You can't afford your half of the mortgage right now anyway. It's the practical thing to do." I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply agreed. Okay, her surprise was evident. She had expected a fight, tears, a scene. My quiet compliance seemed to unsettle her more than any outburst would have. I packed a single bag with a few changes of clothes and my personal laptop. As I walked to the door, she stopped me. "Thomas, I am sorry about your job. It was a lie, a final, perfunctory twist of the knife." "I know," I said, and walked out of the house I had paid for, away from the woman I had loved, and into the beginning of my new life. The hurt was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was now overlaid with a layer of cold, hard purpose. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a broken man. They had made a profound miscalculation. I didn't go to my brother's house. Instead, I drove to a modest extended-stay hotel on the other side of the city. The room was sterile and impersonal, but it was a fortress. It was a command center. The first and only call I made was to Mark. Mark wasn't just my lawyer. He was the only person in the world who knew the truth about my life, a truth I had kept hidden for years, even from my own wife. "She did it," I said as soon as he picked up. "She took the bait." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas. Truly. I was hoping you were wrong about her." "Hope is a failed strategy," I replied, the words coming out colder than I intended. "She kicked me out. She's with David. They have a plan to take the house and get alimony based on my newly reduced circumstances." Mark let out a low whistle. "They're not very creative, are they?" "Okay. So we proceed as planned. Phase 2 is now in effect. Are you sure you want to do this? There's no going back from here." I looked around the empty hotel room. It was the physical manifestation of what Clara and David had left me with. Nothing. They left me with nothing, Mark. They planned to strip me of everything I've built. The only thing I have left is the truth. And I'm going to use it. All right. Mark's voice was firm, professional. "First things first. Secure your personal assets. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow morning. Well, let her file first. Let her put all her demands in writing. Let her build our case for us. That was the turning point. The moment the grief and the shock were burned away by a singular, logical purpose. I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be the architect of a reckoning. My wife and my best friend had grossly underestimated the okayest coder. They thought they knew. They had no idea that Sterling Solutions, the company that had so unceremoniously fired me, was a very small, very public-facing subsidiary of a much larger, much more private technology consortium. A consortium that I owned. The layoff hadn't been a layoff. It had been a strategic resignation. For years, I had lived a lie, a carefully constructed life of middle-class mediocrity. I had started my company in my early 20s, and through a combination of luck and hard work, it had become wildly successful. But I had seen what sudden wealth did to people. I wanted a partner who loved me for who I was, not for what I had. So, I created the persona of Thomas, the mid-level software engineer. I bought Sterling Solutions through a holding company and installed myself in a modest role. I paid myself a respectable but not extravagant salary. The house, the cars, the entire life Clara knew, were all owned by that holding company, TH Holdings. It was a test, a decade-long test of character. And Clara had just failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The following weeks were a study in methodical execution. I traded the hotel for a small, furnished apartment in a part of town Clara would never visit. I bought a cheap, used car. To the outside world, I was exactly what she believed me to be. A man cast adrift, struggling to stay afloat. I even took a part-time job at a local computer repair shop. A detail Mark ensured would make its way into the preliminary financial disclosures for the divorce. Meanwhile, Mark and I were building our fortress. He drew up the necessary documents to formally dissolve my connection to the Sterling Solutions persona. We tracked Clara's spending with meticulous detail. She and David were not being subtle. They were living large, fueled by the assumption of a future windfall. Lavish dinners, weekend trips, a new wardrobe for her, a down payment on a sports car for him, all charged to the credit cards linked to the household account. An account which was, of course, a corporate account owned by TH Holdings. Every receipt was a nail in her coffin. I saw them once in person. I was walking down the street and saw them coming out of a high-end jewelry store. Laughing. Clara was holding up her left hand, admiring a new, garish diamond ring on her finger. She looked happy, happier than I had ever seen her. David looked proud, like a peacock showing off its feathers. They didn't see me. I was just a ghost from a life they had already forgotten. The sight should have hurt, but it didn't. It was just data, more evidence for the file. Maintaining my composure was the hardest part. There were nights I lay awake, the sheer audacity of their betrayal replaying in my mind. The years of my life I had given her, the trust one had placed in both of them. It was a deep wound, but I channeled that pain into focus. I spent my days working with Mark, going over legal strategy, and my nights planning the next phase for my real company, a new project that had been on the back burner for years. My simple life was a cover, but it was also a cleansing. It stripped away all the pretense and left only what was real. As expected, 2 months after I left, I was served with divorce papers. I read them in my small apartment, a wry smile on my face. It was a masterpiece of greed and fiction. Her lawyer, a bulldog from a top family law firm, had painted a picture of a long-suffering wife, emotionally abandoned by a work-obsessed husband, and now financially abandoned after his professional failure. She demanded the house, its contents, her car, permanent alimony based on my previous salary, and half of my 401k and company pension, which she assumed were substantial. It was a declaration of war based on a complete misunderstanding of the battlefield. Mark was ecstatic. "It's better than I could have hoped for," he said over the phone. "She's committed every falsehood to a legal document. She's claiming ownership of assets that are not and have never been marital property. This is a gift." Thomas. Clara, emboldened by my lack of an immediate counterfiling, grew more confident. She and David moved forward with their wedding plans. She called me once, her voice dripping with false concern. "Thomas, I heard you're working at a repair shop. I'm so sorry it's come to this. My lawyer says we should try to settle this amicably. If you just agree to my terms, we can avoid a messy court battle. It's for the best. Your terms are unreasonable, Clara, I said, my voice calm and even. She scoffed. Unreasonable? I'm the one who has to pick up the pieces of my life. You're the one who failed. You have no leverage here. Just sign the papers and let us both move on. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She saw my silence as weakness, my simple life as proof of my defeat. She and her mother, a woman who had always viewed me with a certain disdain, were her biggest cheerleaders. I knew from mutual acquaintances that her mother, Janice, was telling everyone what a bullet Clara had dodged, and how David was a real man, a provider, unlike her feckless former son-in-law. Janice was a co-signer on several of Clara's new credit cards, a fact Mark's forensic accountant had discovered with glee. The enabler was about to become entangled in the consequences. The catalyst for the beginning of her downfall was not me, but David's own hubris. He worked in sales for a competitor of one of my other subsidiary companies. Flush with what he believed was impending wealth, he got sloppy. He started making promises to clients he couldn't keep and was caught falsifying sales reports to boost his commission. An internal investigation was launched. David, completely oblivious to the fact that his company's new silent parent corporation was T.H. Holdings, believed he could talk his way out of it. The first sign of trouble reached Clara when David's corporate credit card was declined at a restaurant. A week later, he was suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation. Their river of easy money suddenly dried up. The panic began to set in. The lavish lifestyle came to a screeching halt. The wedding plans were put on hold. That's when she called me again. This time, her tone was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, wheedling edge. Thomas? It's me. I was thinking. Maybe we were too hasty. Were we? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Yes, we had 10 years together. That has to count for something. People make mistakes. I made a mistake. David, he's not who I thought he was. This whole thing has been a nightmare. It was a classic manipulation attempt. She was trying to retreat to safe ground, to see if the doormat she thought she'd thrown out was still waiting by the door. You filed for divorce, Clara. You're demanding the house and alimony. You got engaged to my best friend. Those don't seem like mistakes. They seem like choices. I was confused. I was scared. You lost your job and I panicked, she said, her voice rising. But I see things clearly now. I want to come home. I want to fix this. We can withdraw the divorce filing. We can be a family again. I let the silence sit for a long moment. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, shallow and anxious. No, Clara. We can't. What do you mean? No? Thomas, don't be like this. Don't be cruel. The mediation is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning, I said. My voice as flat as a dial tone. My lawyer will see your lawyer there. There is nothing else for us to discuss. I hung up the phone before she could respond. The desperate plea had come, and it had been rejected. The trap was set. Now all we had to do was spring it. The day of the mediation arrived, a crisp autumn morning. I wore a simple, dark suit, one I had owned for years. It was well-made but unassuming. Mark and I met in the lobby of the law firm that was acting as the neutral ground. He carried a thick leather briefcase. I carried nothing. Ready? He asked, his expression serious. I've been ready for months, I replied. We entered the conference room. It was all polished mahogany and muted tones, designed to project an aura of calm civility. Clara and her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Ms. Albright, were already seated. Clara looked pale and drawn. The confident, radiant woman from the jewelry store was gone, replaced by someone who looked haunted by impending bills. She refused to meet my eyes. David was not present. He had already been cast aside, a failed investment. The mediator, a retired judge with a weary expression, began the proceedings with a call for cooperation and compromise. Ms. Albright launched into her opening statement, recounting the fictional narrative of my failure and Clara's suffering. She reiterated their demands: the house, the car, alimony, retirement funds. It was the same list from the initial filing. They hadn't budged an inch, a sure sign of their desperation. I sat in silence, my hands resting on the table. I listened as she detailed my supposed cruelty and neglect. I listened as she painted Clara as a victim of circumstance. When she finished, the mediator turned to us. "Mr. Harris, Mr. Sterling, your response." Mark opened his briefcase. He didn't speak. Instead, he took out a single, thick document and slid it across the table to Ms. Albright. "We reject all of the plaintiff's claims," Mark said calmly, "and we would like to present our own evidence." Starting with Exhibit A, Ms. Albright picked up the document. Her brow furrowed as she read the first page. It was the Articles of Incorporation for T.H. Holdings. She flipped through the pages, her confusion turning to visible alarm. Clara looked from her lawyer's face to mine, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I don't understand," Ms. Albright said, looking at Mark. "What is this?" "That," Mark explained, his voice even and precise, "is the legal documentation for the corporation that is the sole owner of the property at 124 Willow Creek Lane, the vehicle your client currently drives, and the source of the salary Mr. Harris was paid for the last 10 years. T.H. Holdings is a private consortium. The T.H. stands for Thomas Harris. My client is the sole proprietor." The silence in the room was absolute. Ms. Albright's jaw went slack. Clara's face went white as a sheet. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, as if seeing me for the first time. "The house is not marital property," Mark continued, his voice relentless. "It is a corporate asset, which my client was permitted to use as part of his compensation package. The same is true for the car. Since my client's employment with the subsidiary, Sterling Solutions, has been terminated, both assets are to be vacated and returned to the holding company immediately." This is absurd," Ms. Albright stammered, shuffling through the papers as if hoping to find a flaw. "He can't have. We ran a full financial check." "You ran a check on Thomas Harris, mid-level coder," Mark corrected her. "You did not run a check on the intricate corporate structure he established over a decade ago for the precise purpose of protecting his assets from this exact kind of predatory litigation. He lived modestly to find a partner who valued the man, not the money." It seems he found his answer. Clara finally found her voice. It was a choked whisper. "You lied to me. For 10 years, you lied to me." I met her gaze for the first time that day. The hurt was gone. The anger was gone. All I felt was a profound and weary pity. "No, Clara. I lived a simple life. You're the one who was disappointed by it. I gave you every opportunity to be a partner. You chose to be a passenger. And when the ride got bumpy, you tried to steal the car." Mark slid a second file across the table. "Exhibit B. Itemized credit card statements for the last 3 months. From the corporate account your client continued to use after the separation. The charges total over $50,000. Dinners, hotels, clothing, and a $10,000 engagement ring for Mr. David Morrison. Since these were not business expenses, we will be seeking full reimbursement from your client. We will also be filing a corporate theft complaint if the amount is not repaid within 30 days. Clara made a small, strangled sound. Her mother's name was on some of those accounts. She had dragged her own enabler down with her. "Furthermore," Mark said, his voice like chips of ice, "regarding Mr. Morrison, as you may know, he was recently terminated from his position at Intercorp Solutions. What you may not know is that T.H. Holdings completed a quiet acquisition of Intercorp 6 months ago. My client was his boss. The internal investigation that led to his termination was initiated at my client's direct order. The evidence of fraud was substantial. We will not be pressing criminal charges, as we consider his termination and public disgrace to be sufficient." This was the final blow. The full scope of the situation finally crashed down on Clara. Her new life, her upgrade, the man she had thrown me away for. He wasn't just a failure. He was a casualty of the man she had so thoroughly underestimated. Her entire world, the one she thought she was building and the one she thought she was leaving, was an illusion I had constructed and could dismantle at will. She began to tremble, her eyes wide with a horror that was almost primal. She looked at me, not with anger, but with a dawning, terrifying comprehension. She hadn't just been married to a coder. She had been married to a king who had chosen to live in a cottage, and she had complained about the drafts. "So," the mediator said, clearing his throat, his professional weariness replaced by a look of stunned fascination. "To summarize, the plaintiff's demands for property and alimony are withdrawn." Ms. Albright, looking utterly defeated, just nodded numbly. "Yes, we withdraw," Clara broke. A low, guttural sob escaped her lips, and then another. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The sound was raw and ugly. It was the sound of a person's world ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of legal documents on a polished table. I stood up. Mark stood with me. I didn't look at her again. I had seen enough. My judgment was rendered. Her collapse was her own to experience. I had no more role to play in her life. "We're done here," I said quietly to Mark. We walked out of the conference room, leaving the sound of her weeping behind us. We didn't speak as we rode the elevator down or as we walked out into the bright afternoon sun. There was nothing left to say. The plan had been executed. The victory was complete. It was also hollow. There is no real joy in destroying someone, even someone who has wronged you so profoundly. There is only a quiet, somber sense of order being restored. A few weeks later, the final divorce decree arrived in the mail. It was a thin envelope. I signed my copy and sent it back. I learned through the grapevine that Clara and her mother had to sell their own family home to cover the debts she had accrued. She moved into a small apartment on the bad side of town. David was last seen working a commission-only job selling discount phone plans. They were ghosts, footnotes in a chapter of my life that was now firmly closed. My new life began. I moved my operations into a new, state-of-the-art office building downtown. The project I had been planning for years was now my full focus. It was challenging, exciting work. I was surrounded by a team of brilliant, loyal people who respected me for my vision and my integrity, not a fabricated persona. One evening, I was standing in my new office, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights spread out below me like a carpet of stars. The view was expansive, almost infinite. The pain of Clara's betrayal had faded, leaving behind not a scar, but a smooth, hard surface of wisdom. I had built a fortress of wealth to protect myself, but the real fortress was the one I had built inside. It was made of self-respect, integrity, and the quiet confidence of knowing who I was. I had sought a partner to share my life, but I had learned a harder lesson. A life built on a lie, no matter how well-intentioned, will always crumble. Truth is the only foundation that holds. Clara and David had been blinded by their own greed and ambition. They saw a simple man and assumed he was small. They never bothered to look deeper. They never understood that a man's worth isn't measured by the job he holds or the car he drives, but by the quiet strength of his character. I had lost a wife and a friend, but in the end, I had found myself. And in the quiet solitude of my new beginning, I was finally at peace.